Hi there, welcome to Fantasy Hub. I'm Mia, your storyteller. Today's story is filled with heartache, discovery, and a twist you won't see coming. So let's begin.
I never believed in love at first sight until I saw her sleeping in the crew quarters at 35,000 feet. You know how they say some people are born to fly? Well, I was born to command the sky. Captain Harper Vaughn, that's me, and at 32. I'd already logged more flight hours than pilots twice my age. Pacific Sky Airlines was my kingdom, and I ruled it with precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep with envy. Then Georgia Cole walked into my perfectly ordered world and turned everything upside down. It started on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were my favorite, clear schedules, predictable routes, no drama. I was reviewing pre-flight checks when she appeared in the doorway of the crew lounge like some kind of vision. Tall, with this cascade of auburn hair. She kept trying to tame into regulation standards, and these impossible green eyes that seemed to hold secrets I suddenly needed to know. "You must be Captain Vaughn," she said, extending a hand that was surprisingly calloused for someone so luminous. "Georgia Cole, your new co-pilot trainee." I shook her hand firm grip, confident, and felt something electric shoot straight up my arm. Professional Harper would have pulled away immediately. Instead, I held on a beat too long, studying the way her mouth curved when she smiled. "Welcome to Pacific Sky," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "Hope you're ready to learn from the best." She laughed then, this rich, warm sound that made something in my chest flutter. "Oh, I'm counting on it, Captain." The first few flights were torture, pure, exquisite torture. Georgia was good better than good. She was intuitive in a way that usually took years to develop. She anticipated my commands, read weather patterns like poetry, and handled the stick with an artist's touch. But it was the way she hummed under her breath during long stretches of autopilot that nearly undid me. The soft, barely audible melody that wrapped around my rib cage and squeezed. I tried to keep things professional. God, how I tried. But Georgia had this way of looking at me when she thought I wasn't watching, like she was solving a puzzle she found particularly fascinating. And when she laughed at my terrible aviation jokes that no one else found funny, I was gone. Absolutely, completely gone. The breaking point came 2 weeks into her training. I was in the crew lounge, staring at weather reports that painted a concerning picture for our upcoming Pacific crossing. Storm systems were building, and the radar looked like an abstract painting done in shades of trouble. I was so focused on plotting alternate routes that I didn't notice Georgia approaching until a coffee cup appeared on my charts. Black coffee. 2 sugars. Exactly how I liked it. "You're staring at that radar like it insulted your ancestors," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. I looked up, startled. "How did you know I take 2 sugars?" "I pay attention," she said simply, but there was something in her eyes that made my pulse skip. "You should try it sometime." "I pay attention to everything," I protested, though my voice sounded defensive even to my own ears. "Do you?" She leaned forward, close enough that I caught a hint of her perfume, something clean and woody that reminded me of mountain mornings. "Because I've been trying to get your attention for 2 weeks now." The words hung between us like a challenge. I knew I should shut this down, maintain professional boundaries, think about careers and regulations and all the very good reasons why this was a terrible idea. Instead, I heard myself say, "Sit down, Cole. You're blocking my light." She grinned. Then this slow, devastating smile that made my stomach flip. "Yes, ma'am. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing." Just as I was beginning to think maybe, just maybe, I could navigate this impossible attraction, Captain Reyes appeared like a storm cloud. Miguel Reyes was old school 40 years in the cockpit, with a mustache that had seen more air traffic. than most people see ground traffic. He pulled me aside after our briefing with the subtlety of a hurricane. "You screw up her training, Evelvon, and I'll know exactly what's in your flight plan," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades in the industry. "That girl's got potential. Don't let your distractions ruin her career." The threat was clear, and it hit me like turbulence. My career was stratospheric youngest captain in Pacific Sky's history, fast-tracked for international routes, being considered for fleet commander. Georgia's career was just taking off. One wrong move from me, one hint of impropriety, and I could destroy everything she'd worked for. So I pulled back, professional distance, clipped responses. I turned myself into the Ice Queen every trainee feared, hoping it would be enough to kill whatever was growing between us. Georgia noticed immediately, of course. How could she not? But instead of backing down, she pushed harder, staying late to review flight procedures, asking pointed questions that had nothing to do with aviation and everything to do with the way I suddenly couldn't meet her eyes, bringing me coffee every morning with that knowing smile that suggested she could see right through my defenses. Then came Flight 422 to Tokyo. It was supposed to be routine 13 hours across the Pacific. Business travelers and tourists, clear skies, and favorable winds. Georgia had passed her preliminary evaluations with flying colors, and this was meant to be her final assessment flight. One perfect crossing, and she'd earn her wings with Pacific Sky. I should have known the universe wouldn't make it that simple. We were 6 hours out, cruising at 37,000 feet over endless blue when it happened. One moment we were discussing approach vectors for Narita, and the next the sound was like a cannon going off. The plane lurched violently to the left, throwing passengers against their restraints. Overhead compartments flew open, spilling luggage and chaos. The cabin filled with screams as emergency oxygen masks deployed like yellow flowers blooming in terror. Engine 2 failure. Georgia's voice cut through the noise of my headset, calm and steady despite the crisis. Fire suppression activated. My hands moved on autopilot, years of training kicking in as I fought to stabilize the aircraft. We were losing altitude fast, the remaining engine straining to compensate for its dead partner. Below us, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beautiful and deadly. Declaring Mayday, I announced to air traffic control, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Pacific Sky 422, engine failure, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. Harper. George's voice was quiet, in my ear, using my first name for the first time in weeks. "I've got your 6. Those 4 words shouldn't have meant everything, but they did. In that moment, with 300 souls depending on us and the ocean waiting below, I realized something that should have terrified me. I trusted her completely. "Take communications," I ordered. "Keep the passengers calm. I need to focus on flying this bird." For the next 2 hours, we worked in perfect synchronization. Georgia handled passenger communications with a steady voice that somehow convinced 300 terrified people that everything would be fine, while I nursed our wounded aircraft through a series of increasingly desperate maneuvers. We diverted to Anchorage, the closest airport with a runway long enough to handle our approach. The landing was controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles lined the runway like Christmas lights, and foam covered the tarmac in case of fire. I brought USN steep and fast, the single engine screaming in protest, while Georgia called out altitudes and speeds with mechanical precision. 50 feet ... 30 ... 20 ... The wheels kissed the runway with barely a bump. I've made thousands of landings in my career, but none had ever felt like that, like we just cheated death through sheer force of will. The cabin erupted in applause as we rolled to a stop. Passengers were crying, laughing, hugging strangers. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with professional calm, but I could see their hands shaking. "Nice job, Captain," Georgia said, quietly, and when I looked at her, there were tears in her eyes. "We did it," I corrected. "We both did it." The debriefing took hours. NTSB investigators, airline executives, reporters who somehow materialized despite our remote location. Everyone wanted to know how two pilots managed to save 300 lives with a catastrophic engine failure over the Pacific. By the time we finally made it to the hotel, I was running on fumes and adrenaline. The company had booked us rooms on different floors, standard protocol, but as I stood in the elevator, watching the numbers climb, all I could think about was how Georgia's hands had stayed steady when mine wanted to shake. How her voice had been my anchor in the storm. I found myself at her door before I'd consciously decided to go there. She answered on the first knock, still in her uniform but with her hair loose around her shoulders. The sight of her made my chest tight. "You saved lives today," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "We saved lives," she corrected, echoing my earlier sentiment. Then quieter, "Harper, what are you doing here?" I should have had an answer. Should have explained about adrenaline and gratitude, and the way she'd looked at me in the cockpit when everything was falling apart. Instead, I stepped forward and kissed her. It was supposed to be gentle a thank you, maybe, or an acknowledgement of what we'd shared in those terrifying hours above the Pacific, but the moment our lips met, something ignited. Her hands fisted in my shirt, pulling me closer, and I tasted relief and desire and something that might have been love on her tongue. We stumbled backward into her room, hands frantically working at buttons and zippers, mouths breaking apart only long enough to breathe. Her uniform jacket hit the floor, followed by my tie, my shirt. The "Do Not Disturb" sign swayed as the door slammed shut behind us. "Are you sure?" She whispered against my neck, and I could feel her pulse racing under my lips. "I've never been more sure of anything," I said, and it was true. For once in my life, I wasn't thinking about consequences or regulations or career trajectories. Just Georgia, soft and warm and real in my arms. We made love with the desperate intensity of people who'd just stared death in the face and chosen life. Her skin was silk under my fingers, her breath hot against my ear as she whispered my name. Like a prayer. When she cried out, back arching beneath me, I felt like I could fly without an airplane. Afterward, we lay tangled in hotel sheets that smelled like industrial laundry and possibility. Georgia traced patterns on my chest with her fingertips, and I wondered how I'd ever thought I could keep my distance. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. I should have had an answer for that too. Should have thought about protocols and procedures and all the reasons why this couldn't work. Instead, I pulled her closer and decided to worry about tomorrow when it came. Morning arrived with the subtlety of a collision. I woke to Georgia's phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. She answered with a sleepy hello that turned sharp when she heard the voice on the other end. "Yes, sir, I understand. Yes, I'll be there." She hung up and turned to me, worry creasing her features. "That was HR. They want to see both of us, separately." My blood turned to ice. Someone saw us. It wasn't a question. In an industry as small and gossipy as aviation, nothing stayed secret for long. Especially not when one of the participants was the youngest captain in company history, and the other was a trainee who just helped save 300 lives. The next few hours were brutal. Corporate conference rooms with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look dead. HR representatives with press suits and disappointed expressions. Questions about unprofessional conduct and inappropriate. Relationships delivered in voices that made my skin crawl. "The optics are concerning," Linda Morrison from HR explained, her tone suggesting she was discussing a contagious disease. A captain and her trainee. The power dynamic alone raises significant liability issues. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked, though I already knew. Miss Cole's training is suspended pending investigation. Your promotion to international routes is on hold. We need time to assess the situation. I felt the bottom drop out of my world. Georgia's training suspended. Her career effectively destroyed before it had even begun. All because I couldn't keep my hands to myself. This is ridiculous, I started, but Georgia cut me off. It's fine, she said, though her voice was anything but fine. I understand the company's position, but it wasn't fine. None of this was fine. The investigation dragged on for weeks. Georgia was reassigned to ground duty while I flew with a series of temporary co-pilots who all treated me like I carried some kind of contagious scandal. The rumor mill worked overtime. Some versions had us conducting a torrid affair for months. Others suggested I'd threaten Georgia's career if she didn't sleep with me. The truth, that we were two adults who found each other attractive and acted on it after a traumatic experience, seemed far too simple for corporate America. Georgia and I barely spoke during those weeks. We passed each other in hallways like strangers, maintaining the professional distance we should have kept from the beginning. But sometimes I'd catch her looking at me across the crew lounge, and the sadness in her eyes made my chest ache. I threw myself into work, flying extra routes and accepting every assignment offered. Anything to avoid thinking about the way Georgia hummed when she was concentrating, or how her laugh had sounded in that hotel room in Anchorage. Then, 3 weeks into the investigation, Georgia disappeared. Not literally, she still showed up for her ground assignments and attended her required meetings with HR, but the woman I'd fallen for, with her quick wit and infectious enthusiasm, was gone. In her place was someone hollow-eyed and mechanical, going through the motions of a career that was slowly being strangled by corporate bureaucracy. I found her in the employee parking garage after a particularly brutal day of depositions and interviews. She was sitting in her car, staring at nothing, and when I knocked on the window, she looked at me like she couldn't quite remember who I was. "This is my fault," I said when she rolled down the window. "All of it. Your career, the investigation." "No," she interrupted, her voice flat. "This is their fault. The system that says two consenting adults can't find each other attractive. The culture that punishes women for having sex and gay women for existing. This isn't about what we did, Harper. This is about who we are." She was right, and we both knew it. If I'd been caught with a male co-pilot, there might have been raised eyebrows about fraternization policies, but nothing like this witch hunt. Our gender, our sexuality, it all added layers of scandal that the company seemed determined to exploit. So what do? I asked. Georgia was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, there was steel in her voice I'd never heard before. We fight back. The plan was audacious, borderline insane, and absolutely perfect. Georgia had spent weeks documenting everything: company policies, federal regulations, precedent cases involving discrimination in the airline industry. She'd built a case that would make Harvard lawyers weep with envy. The FAA has clear anti-discrimination guidelines, she explained as we sat in her apartment, surrounded by legal documents and laptop screens. Gender and sexual orientation are protected classes. Pacific Sky is violating federal law by treating us differently than they would a heterosexual couple in the same situation. And you think they'll care about that? I think they'll care about the lawsuit and the media attention and the fact that their newest heroes, the crew who saved Flight 422, are being persecuted for being gay. She was right, of course. The story of our emergency landing had gone viral. We were aviation heroes, the subject of news articles and social media posts, praising our skill and professionalism. If word got out that the same company celebrating our heroics was now destroying our careers over our relationship, we need leverage, I said. Georgia smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her in weeks. Leave that to me. I should have known she had a plan within a plan. The next morning, Georgia stormed into CEO Richard Blackstone's office without an appointment, carrying a briefcase full of documentation and a recording device she'd forgotten to mention to me. I only found out because his secretary called security, and I arrived just in time to hear Georgia's voice echoing down the executive corridor, punishing us for what exactly? Being queer, or being better pilots than your old boys club? I pushed past the security guards gathering outside Blackstone's door and found Georgia standing in front of his massive desk like a warrior queen delivering ultimatums. The CEO, a silver-haired man who'd built his fortune on the backs of underpaid flight crews, looked like he'd swallowed his tongue. "Ms. Cole," he sputtered, "this is highly inappropriate. You know what's inappropriate?" I interrupted, surprising myself with my boldness. Punishing two pilots who saved 300 lives because they had the audacity to find comfort in each other after a traumatic experience. Georgia shot me a grateful look before turning back to Blackstone. "We have documentation. Federal violations, media contacts. The choice is yours, Mr. Blackstone. Change the discriminatory policies, issue a public apology, and reinstate our careers. Or we walk, and we take our story with us." The silence that followed was deafening. Blackstone's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a sickly pale. He knew what we knew, that in the court of public opinion, the company that persecuted its heroes would lose badly. "I'll need to discuss this with the board," he said finally. "You have 24 hours, Georgia replied, her voice steady as stone. "After that, we're taking our talents elsewhere." We walked out of that office together, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The company folded within 6 hours dot by afternoon. We had a joint meeting with HR, legal, and executive staff. Apologies were issued, grudging but official. The investigation was terminated. George's training was reinstated, and my promotion was back on track. New anti-discrimination policies were drafted and implemented company-wide. "Congratulations," Linda Morrison said through gritted teeth, "on your successful resolution." But Georgia wasn't done. "We'll also need a public statement, something acknowledging the company's commitment to equality and supporting all employees regardless of sexual orientation." It's non-negotiable," I said, finding my voice. "Along with diversity training for all management staff." We walked out of that meeting hand in hand, not caring who saw us. The battle was won, but more than that, we'd found something worth fighting. "FOR. Told you I'd get us cleared for takeoff," Georgia said as the elevator doors closed, that wicked grin back in full force. I kissed her then, right there between floors, tasting victory and possibility, and the promise of a future neither of us had dared imagine. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. Georgia finished her training with flying colors, literally, earning commendations from every instructor. The media picked up our story, turning us into unlikely heroes for LGBTQ rights in aviation. Pacific Sky's stock actually rose as they positioned themselves as progressive leaders in workplace equality. But the real victory was smaller, quieter. It was Georgia humming in the cockpit again. It was coffee appearing on my charts, black with 2 sugars. It was falling asleep in her arms and waking up to find her studying my face like she was memorizing. We flew together regularly now, no longer hiding our relationship or pretending we were just colleagues. The crew lounge became our second living room. And other pilots started coming to us for advice about flying, about careers, about navigating workplace relationships in an industry still catching up with the 21st century. You know what I love most about this? Georgia said one evening as we reviewed flight plans for our next Pacific crossing, "What's that? We get to do this for the rest of our lives. Fly together, save people together, fall asleep at 37,000 feet and wake up somewhere new." It sounded perfect. It sounded like everything I'd never known I wanted. That's when I started planning. A year after our first flight together, I had it all figured out. The location, a mountaintop retreat in Colorado that we discovered during a layover. The timing sunset on a clear Saturday when we were both off duty. The ring simple platinum that would fit under flight gloves. But Georgia, as always, was one step ahead of me. I arrived at the retreat to find her teaching yoga to a group of burned-out airline crew members. It was her latest project, a wellness retreat for aviation professionals dealing with stress and trauma. She moved through the poses like water, her voice guiding a dozen pilots and flight attendants through sun salutations as the mountain air filled their lungs. She was wearing my old leather flight jacket, the one I'd given her during a cold layover in Chicago months ago. It was too big for her, but somehow she made it look perfect. I watched from the deck, the ring box heavy in my pocket, planning my romantic sunset proposal. Georgia finished the session and sent her students inside for dinner, then walked over to where I was standing. "Beautiful evening," she said, settling beside me on the deck railing. "Perfect flying weather," I agreed. "Harper, there's something I need to," but she never finished the sentence. Instead, she slipped off the deck railing and dropped to one knee, pulling a ring box from the pocket of my leather jacket. "Marry me," she said, grinning up at me with that devastating smile that had been my undoing from the very first day. "Or I'll actually start following FAA regulations." The ring was simple white gold with a small diamond that caught the sunset and threw it back in rainbow fragments. It was perfect. She was perfect. "Are you seriously proposing to me?" I asked, laughing despite the tears I could feel starting. "I'm seriously proposing to you. I've been carrying this ring around for 3 months, waiting for the perfect moment, and then I realized every moment with you is perfect." I looked at her, kneeling there in the golden light, surrounded by mountains and sky and the kind of quiet beauty that makes you believe in magic. This woman who'd walked into my life and turned everything upside down, who'd saved my career, my heart, my very understanding of what it meant to be alive. "Yes," I said, pulling her to her feet and into my arms. "Yes, absolutely yes." The kiss that followed tasted like forever, like coming home, like everything I'd been searching for without knowing it was missing. We were so lost in each other that we didn't notice the other retreat participants gathering on the deck until the applause started. Someone had captured the proposal on their phone, and within hours it was everywhere: social media, news outlets, aviation blogs. Hashtag Love Flies Higher started trending, along with photos of us kissing against the sunset. But I barely noticed the digital chaos. All I could see was Georgia, my fiancée, planning our future with the same methodical precision she brought to flight planning. "Small wedding," she said as we lay in bed that night, her finger tracing patterns on my chest. "Just family and the crew." "Mountain ceremony?" "Obviously. Can't get married anywhere we can't fly to. Honeymoon in New Zealand. I know some pilots who can get us cockpit jump seats." "God, I love your brain," she said, kissing the spot where my jaw met my neck. We planned everything that night: the wedding, the honeymoon, the business we'd built together, helping other aviation couples navigate the industry's still choppy waters. Georgia had already been contacted by 3 major airlines wanting to consult on diversity and inclusion policies. My reputation as a captain had only grown stronger. After our very public fight with Pacific Sky, the future stretched ahead of us like an endless runway, full of possibility and promise. The wedding was everything we dreamed, intimate, beautiful, and slightly chaotic in the way only aviation families can manage. Captains and flight attendants mixed with our families, trading stories and arguing about approach vectors while we exchanged vows on a mountain peak overlooking 3 states. Georgia wore a simple white dress with my grandmother's, pearls and combat boots that she claimed were more practical for mountain terrain. I wore a navy suit that matched my uniform, and the biggest smile of my life. Captain Reyes officiated. It turned out he'd been a Universal Life Minister for 20 years, marrying crew members who couldn't afford fancy ceremonies. His mustache was perfectly waxed for the occasion, and his voice carried across the mountaintop, like he was calling out vectors to air traffic control. Do you, Harper, take Georgia to be your co-pilot in life? To trust her with your 6 o'clock and your heart through clear skies and turbulence, for as long as you both shall fly? I do, I said, my voice steady despite the tears. And do you, Georgia, take Harper to be your captain and your partner, to follow her lead and challenge her course through emergency landings and smooth takeoffs, for as long as you both shall soar? Hell yes, I do, Georgia said, making everyone laugh. The rings went on easily. We'd worn them on chains around our necks during flights for weeks, getting used to the weight. But having them on our fingers, official and permanent, felt revolutionary. You may kiss your co-pilot, Reyes announced, and Georgia practically launched herself into my arms. The reception was held in the retreat's main hall, with string lights and wildflowers and a cake shaped like a 747. Georgia's cousin, a DJ in Atlanta, had created a playlist that somehow mixed aviation-themed songs with romantic ballads. We danced to Come Fly With Me and God Only Knows, surrounded by the people who'd helped us fight for our right to love each other openly. The best part was watching other couples and the industry pilots who'd been hiding their relationships. Flight attendants who'd never brought partners to crew events, mechanics who'd kept their families separate from work. Seeing us dance together, legally married and publicly celebrated, gave them permission to step out of the shadows too. Look what you've started, Georgia whispered as we swayed to our song. Around us, the dance floor was full of couples who'd found courage in our example. 2 male pilots from United were slow dancing for the first time in public. A flight attendant had brought her wife to a company event. A ground crew supervisor was introducing his husband to coworkers who'd never known he existed. We started it, I corrected. Together. Later, as the party wound down and guests began the complicated logistics of getting home to various cities, Georgia and I slipped away to the deck where she'd proposed. The stars were brilliant at this altitude, scattered across the sky like runway lights stretching into infinity. No regrets? She asked, settling into my arms. I thought about the question seriously. The past year had been intense public scrutiny, corporate battles, media attention neither of us had asked for. Our relationship had been dissected by strangers and held up as a symbol for causes we'd never chosen to represent. But then I looked at Georgia, my wife, silhouetted against the mountain sky, and the answer was simple. None, I said. Not a single one? Good, she said, kissing me softly. Because I have plans for us, Captain Von Cole. Oh, really? What? Kind of plans? The kind that involve a lot more flying, a lot more fighting for people who can't fight for themselves, and a lot more of this, she said, gesturing between us. Sounds perfect. And it was. 5 years later, we run 3 retreat centers for aviation professionals, consult for airlines around the world on inclusive workplace policies, and still fly together whenever our schedules align. Georgia finished her captain's training too, years ago, and now commands her own 787 on international routes. I've been promoted to chief pilot for Pacific Sky's Diversity and Recruitment Division. But the best part, the part that still makes me smile when I think about it, is that every morning I wake up next to the woman who changed my life by walking into a crew lounge and asking if she could learn from the best. She did learn from the best. And so did I. Some love stories are smooth sailing, they say. Ours, all turbulence from the very beginning. And God, was it worth the ride?